Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Thursday, December 19th. I'm Justin Sasher in for Elizabeth Arkalian. In California, thousands of oil wells are no longer in use, but many of them have not been properly sealed.
They are capable of leaking chemicals both into the groundwater and in air, including methane.
Coming up, we'll learn more about one company that oversees nearly a third of those wells. But first, today's headlines. California has declared a state of emergency over bird flu. Governor Gavin Newsom says the order issued on Wednesday will help expedite the response to the growing outbreak. For instance, by ramping up testing and coordinating with the agriculture industry. The virus recently spread to cattle in Southern California after infecting hundreds of Central Valley dairy herds. Dozens of people have been sickened by the virus. There have been no reported human-to-human infections so far. City workers in Fresno called off a strike on Wednesday. As KVPR's Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado reports, a tentative deal was reached between a workers' union and the state's fifth largest city.
The City of Fresno Professional Employees Association launched a 2-day strike this week. Earlier this month, the union rejected a contract from the city. Leaders said it did not meet the needs of workers. Now, Mayor Jerry Dyer says a new deal is on the table.
I'm not going to get into the specifics of the agreement because I don't want to get ahead of the PEA.
Dyer says he's sympathetic to worker needs. He also said the city's spending is outpacing revenues, making it difficult to meet worker demands for a 3% salary increase and other improvements. Union President Jesse Gonzalez hinted that the contract holds promise.
It's definitely, I feel, there's an acceptable offer for my people.
If union members agree, the contract will go to the City Council for approval next month. For KVPR News, I'm Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado.
Former employees are still processing the stiff sentences for the co-founders of Bitwise Industries. A judge this week sentenced them to a combined 20 years in prison. As KVPR's Carrie Klein reports, emotions were high in the federal courtroom.
Irma Ogwin Jr. and Jake Soberall pleaded guilty to $115 million in wire fraud. A year earlier, the two had abruptly furloughed all their employees. But before all that, the business partners were beloved. Tessa Williamson was the company's creative director. She says Bitwise was a good company. And although Soberall and Ogwin Jr. made mistakes, the sentences are too high.
I feel like it's extreme. I don't think that they're a threat to society.
Angelica Cano was a marketing copywriter. She says Irma Ogwin Jr. was a friend, but that the details that have come to light have been painful.
My heart goes out to the families, but I think accountability is the most important thing here.
Theirs were just some of the tears shed in the packed courtroom where no cameras or recording were allowed. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
The Picayune Rancheria of Chukchansi Indians is opposing the establishment of a new national monument. A large swath of the Sierra Nevada would be listed as the Range of Light National Monument under a current proposal. But the tribe issued a letter to the Biden administration stating that the proposal should be rejected. Tribal leaders say they have deep ancestral ties to the land and that the proposed monument could interfere with the use of the land. The letter also says the tribe has not been consulted on the proposal. A woman who was mauled to death by a pack of dogs in the Madera County foothills has been identified as a teenager. Loved ones tell ABC 30 that 18-year-old Lexus Salas was the victim of the attack. A GoFundMe page for Salas has reached nearly $6,000 as of Wednesday. The dogs involved in the attack were described as pit bull mixes. Officials from the Madera County Sheriff's Office say 3 dogs were euthanized as a result. Their owner was cooperating with authorities in the investigation.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from Fresno Mazda, part of the Prieto Automotive family, with special holiday financing deals on select models through the end of the year at the new showroom on Blackstone and Barstow. Information at myfresnomazda.com.
And now, on to our main story. California has thousands of oil wells that haven't been in operation for years, in some cases decades. They're what's known as idle wells. And nearly a third of all those wells are affiliated with the company known as California Resources Corporation, or CRC. The company recently merged with Aera Energy, a Bakersfield-based oil producer. That makes CRC one of the largest oil and gas producers in the state. Emma Feringer Merchant is a contributing writer for Inside Climate News. She has recently reported on the company and its idle wells and produced her report in partnership with KVPR. Feringer Merchant found that the issue of idle wells is raising many questions. As oil production declines in the state and oil producers look to other sources of revenue, idle wells can still pose challenges to people and towns. Feringer Merchant recently spoke with KVPR's Elizabeth Arkalian and first gave an overview of CRC.
Yeah, so California Resources Corporation is one of the largest oil and gas companies in California. They recently merged with another of the largest oil and gas companies in California, Aera. And CRC went through a bankruptcy a few years ago. And since coming out of bankruptcy, they've seen their stock increase, they're making money, and they also obviously went through this merger. So they're now looking to carbon storage as a new business line that they're interested in investing in. And it's a bit unclear what its future may look like as California oil production continues declining, but the company sees carbon storage as an important business that it wants to invest in.
Yeah, you report that CRC is investing in this carbon removal strategy as a way to increase their revenue in the future. But in your reporting, you also look at these idle wells across California. So tell us a little more about what those are and what those current connections are between those idle wells and this company, CRC.
So there are thousands of idle wells across the state, and an idle well is a well that has not been producing for at least 2 years, and it has not been cleaned up and abandoned by the operator. CRC is responsible for a good chunk of those wells in the state, as is Aera, the company that it recently merged with. When it comes to carbon removal plans, these companies are considering injecting carbon underground into geologic formations. And CRC has told me that their idle wells may have the potential for reuse in carbon storage. So while those wells do have regulations under state rules, there is the potential that they may be repurposed in some way for carbon storage in the future.
And just to drill into this a little more, these idle wells can pose problems for communities, right?
Yes, they are capable of leaking chemicals both into the groundwater and in air, including methane, which is a greenhouse gas, which is one of the reasons why it's important to properly abandon and clean them up. There's no limit in California to how long a well can remain idle. There are fees that operators have to pay and plans they have to submit, but the state does allow wells to remain idle for years and sometimes decades.
I want to go back to this carbon capture project. What was interesting to me was that you spoke with a Yale Law School professor who saw CRC's carbon capture project, which is known as Carbon TerraVault 1, as a way to potentially delay plugging these old wells. So do you know how do you plug a well? And if there is a delay, is anyone responsible for that?
Plugging a well is a complex engineering project, but it includes remediation around the well as well as plugging with cement. But in terms of the delays, some sources I spoke to felt that because CRC could potentially redevelop those wells later and has expressed interest in doing so, that could push out cleanup timelines longer than they are at this point, because those wells may become productive in some sense later on, as opposed to just remaining idle in perpetuity.
And could this in any way, as we're dealing with a changing landscape in California around climate and goals, could this in any way affect taxpayers?
So California requires that oil companies set aside a certain amount of money in bonds to be used to clean up their wells in the future. But many sources I spoke to said that those bonds are insufficient to cover the full costs of cleanup at this point. And they said the same is true for CRC. At this point, the amount that CRC has set aside is just over 100 million, and different estimates of how much retiring those wells and cleaning them up in the future may cost is over 1 billion. So there is concern that as California oil production continues to decline, these companies will not be making the same revenues that they have in the past and may have insufficient money set aside with the state to pay for those cleanup costs. And if there's not a responsible operator who can pay, there is a possibility that taxpayers will have to pay for those wells to be cleaned up.
So what's next for CRC as they build out their carbon capture technology in Kern County?
So Kern County has approved the project. It's currently awaiting approval from the US EPA. At least one of CRC's applications could be decided on by the EPA by the end of this year. There is a bit of a complication in that community and environmental groups recently filed a lawsuit related to the project in November, arguing that the county did not consider all of the environmental implications that it should in approving it. So that has the potential to change how the project moves forward. But because that lawsuit was filed so recently, that is still a bit uncertain at this point. Prior to that lawsuit, CRC had planned to begin construction in 2025.
That was KVPR's Elizabeth Arkalian speaking with Emma Faringer Merchant. She's a contributing writer for Inside Climate News and recently reported a story on California's idle wells in partnership with KVPR. That report can be found at kvpr.org. And that does it for today. If you have feedback or a story idea for Central Valley Daily, we'd love to hear from you. Just email podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Justin Sacher. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.